Hi, my name is Kenza, and I'm the coach of the Dulwich College debating team and a 2015 Mace regional finalist. I'm joined here by three-time national finalists Luke Jensen-Jones and Joe Atkinson, who are going to share a little bit of advice on how they prepare to take part in the Mace format. So the first question I have for you guys is, how do you guys start your process when you first receive a motion? What's the very first thing you start thinking about or start doing?
Well, a lot of the time, the motion's been set for a reason. There are current events going on which make it particularly interesting and context to be thinking about. But even if there isn't, the easiest first step is just thinking, what problem is this motion trying to solve? And on opposition, having an awareness of how it might make that problem worse or might make other problems even worse as well.
Great, that's some really useful advice. So once you guys have thought about some of the initial concerns in the debate, what recent events might be relevant to the motion, how do you then practice for what the actual Mace round is going to be like?
So a lot of the time what we do is we'll get other people from our school that do debating as well to come and practice with us. We'll get them to prep the motion and then debate against us. That's helpful because it gives us an idea of what rebuttal we might have to prepare or type of argument. It's also helpful because it helps us to then think about our reply speeches, maybe what questions we might get asked by the audience. It's a really useful way of preparing and just making sure we know what to expect.
The one problem with that, though, is a lot of the time what happens in Mace, because you can think through it all in advance, is that you start debating what you think the other side is going to say, not what they actually say. So you still need to be adaptive in the debate to what comes up.
Do you have any advice for how teams can be adaptive as the debate happens and not just rely too much on the notes or what they might have thought the opposition team was going to say in the debate?
I think it's just a question of listening to what the other side say, making sure that maybe you don't write out speeches entirely and just have bullet point notes, for example, of the case you want to run, so that then if something badly goes wrong or something happens that you weren't expecting, you're not fully reliant on that singular argument that you then have to drop.
Great. I think one thing that I did as well is have lots of different ideas for what the opposition could potentially run and list out responses to all of those different ideas and then pick and choose based on which arguments they actually end up running in the debate. The final question I have for you guys is, what are some of the differences between preparing for a BP competition in the British parliamentary format and preparing for a debate that's happening in the Mace format?
Well, the big thing is time. You have time to prepare, you have time to research, know your facts. But it's really crucial, instead of just saying a number, explain those examples, explain the things you've researched. Because a lot of the time, by the end of the process, you'll be extremely knowledgeable and you'll know how these things happened, how they relate to the motion. And just explaining that to the judge could be much more powerful than just saying X% of people did this after this. So having a really good idea of what it looks like, I think is very important in Mace.
Great. And are there any other differences that you would highlight between the British parliamentary format and the Mace format?
Yeah, I think a really important one is style. Obviously, you've got longer to give your speeches, and the judges are really looking for you to just be a bit slower with how you give it. And I just think being more emotive in terms of the way that you give those arguments and examples, as Joe was saying, particularly when you've already researched them and you've got the examples to back your case up. It's then just about making sure that you're actually sort of bringing them home powerfully and making people actually want to believe what you say.
Awesome. That's really helpful, guys. Thanks for sharing those tips. So we're now going to work through a practice debate that we've been preparing on the motion. This House believes that English curriculums should replace historically classic works, such as the works of Shakespeare and Dickens, with modern books, such as The Hunger Games. What we're going to do is we will hear the first proposition speech from Zaki. We'll then talk through some potential opposition responses, and then we'll hear the second proposition speech delivered by Daniel. This is a really useful activity to get an idea of how arguments are going to sound when they're delivered, but also to begin thinking about what the likely clashes are going to be in the debate from the opposition arguments in the round. Zaki, over to you to deliver the first proposition speech on this motion.
All right, so in today's speech, I'm going to do three main things. Firstly, I'm going to provide you with a model as to how we would carry this out. Secondly, I'm going to provide a principled justification for the motion. And thirdly, I'm going to provide a practical argument as to why removing classical books from the English curriculum gives more engagement in this material. Okay, so first, on to the model then. So we would clearly we would remove classical texts from the curriculum, and we replace them with more modern texts, like things like The Hunger Games or the works of Terry Pratchett or Neil Gaiman. And then we would still suggest that this would be a part of things like uni or A-level curriculum. So moving on to the principle then. So the reason why we think that this is not having classical books in the English curriculum is not justified principally is that it doesn't really help the purpose of the education system. The education system is firstly to instill a love of learning in children for later life, and secondly, it is to prepare them for real life, prepare them for jobs and things like that. We think these classical texts don't really represent modern life, and they don't really provide any insights that would necessarily help someone to, say, get a job or to pass the bar exam or something like that. What we think these texts do provide are very antiquated views, things like Robinson Crusoe or the works of Rudyard Kipling or of indeed Mice and Men. They all of these texts offer very old-fashioned views that aren't particularly valuable to instilling a love of learning or indeed helping students in later life. Okay, so moving on to my second point. No. So these classical texts aren't particularly engaging for students to learn about. We think the likes of Shakespeare and Dickens are quite hard to access as they are written in a very old-fashioned way. They in a way that isn't often spoken by very many people. So disadvantaged children, whether that be people whose second language is English or people with learning difficulties, will very much struggle to access any kind of benefits that of these texts. We think that a lot of the good material that will type in these classical texts are found in tropes within modern books, so we think there isn't anything lost from none of these classical texts in the curriculum. We think that, in fact, in making these the curriculum of English more accessible at a younger stage, we think that we allow people to fall in love with English and to be more engaged with the English language, which means that in their further education, they may be more likely to choose to study these classical texts of their own volition. We think this is incredibly valuable because of the impacts I just stated. So, what have I told you in this debate? So, I've given you a mech as to how we would undertake this. I've given you a principled justification for removing classical texts from the English curriculum. And thirdly, I have explained to you why this leads to more engagement in English curriculum for younger students. Thank you.
Great. That was really awesome, Zaki. Thanks for that. There's a couple of things that I think we should probably tweak about our first proposition case for the round. The first is that we should probably, in your speech, think a little bit more about stylistic variation and characterization. One of the things that's really important for the MACE format is that we're adding examples that are going to resonate with the audience. So maybe in your first argument, we just add in a joke about how much we actually paid attention when studying the works of Shakespeare and how much more interesting we would have found it if we could study the Hunger Games instead. I think something like that would make it a lot easier to bring the judge onto our side. The second thing is we should maybe think a little bit more about what statistics might help us, particularly with our second argument about the likelihood of students engaging with the English curriculum. Perhaps if we could look up after this session, a couple of examples on what percentage of students that study English at GCSE go on to continue to study at A-level or university level. And if we could add in those examples, I think it would be easier for us to explain that the current English curriculum is encouraging enough students to continue studying English because you don't find the text that they're studying currently appealing to them or particularly interesting. Did you guys have anything to add, Joe or Luke?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd really like to see is an introduction I think a lot of the time in Mace, an emotive introduction can do a lot to just introduce your side. Clearly, it might just be comparing two books, or it might be specifically on one example, but really walking through the experience of being a kid learning in English lessons, I think would be a good thing to add, so you can really show how you're impacting things by changing the books that child is studying.
Definitely. That would be really useful. One concern I'm having is that the opposition is really likely to make an argument about the fact that if students don't study the works of Shakespeare and Dickens in school, when will they study those texts? Often you need a teacher alongside to walk you through the more intricate difficulties of a work of Shakespeare in a way that you probably don't need a teacher or a guide to help you read The Hunger Games. So how do you think that we should respond to that argument from the opposition?
Well, I guess you could argue that in terms of walking them through that kind of information, you could argue that the history might be a better place to those kinds of things, because a wider context of the time in which those texts were written would often help to inform the way in which you read those books and read those texts by understanding what world they were written in.
Yeah, that's a really great one. So maybe it's a question of moving this material into other subjects or other curriculums rather than continuing to engage with them in our English classes. But we always remember we can't only have one response. What other responses could we give to that argument?
I guess you don't engage with it and you don't actually get anything from these historical texts if you're not enjoying English at all, and like at the point that you're just like dreading English lessons. Whereas in the future, when you actually enjoy English and you do it at A-level in university, then that's the point when you can study these texts in more detail, and to the point where you actually enjoy them and are able to engage with them in great detail.
Great. I think that's a really useful response for us to give. Okay. Daniel, let's hear your substantive material. So we won't hear the rebuttal, and we won't hear any of your defense of Zaki's material, but I just want to get a sense of what material we're going to have in our second proposition speech. And this is also a really great opportunity for us to time how long your substantive material is, so we know how long it's going to last in the debate. Go for it.
Dull, dreary, and wholly uninspiring. That is the sad truth of the current education system, where minorities and women find themselves wholly unrepresented as they move through the education system. I'm going to bring you one point in today's speech, why it's important that we represent more diverse characters in the literature that young people are reading. We think, firstly, the current books that are being taught don't represent diverse pictures of who can be heroes and who can be heroines. We think they're often, these are often quite old books that come from a time where the racial and social makeup of society was very different. And we think that they often have very misogynistic attitudes and narratives towards women, which show backward treatment and attitudes towards women. For example, the portrayal of Juliet in Shakespeare, or they often represent racial minority. They often only represent racial majorities, and when minorities happen to be presented, they're often only presented in either a bad way or as in some way inferior, for example, in of Western men. And they often also don't represent like really important LGBT issues or issues of depression that are really important to society at the moment. Whereas we think modern books are different because they have diverse protagonists and heroes, which show what real society looks like. It's people like Katniss Everdeen in The Hunger Games, or Coraline in the book Coraline. We think that they have more relatable problems and values that are actually useful to the young people of today. But so what books you're reading at school is incredibly impactful and important, because the time that you have at school has a huge impact on you, and it shapes your worldview immensely. And we think that it makes up most of your childhood, and it makes up what subjects you're going to spend the rest of your life like working on. We think this is particularly going to affect minority groups, because to the extent that they're never really able to see themselves represented, and they only see like white men being able to achieve their dreams and be successful, we think these narratives are probably subliminally imprinted on their minds over a period of time. And we think that therefore they're less likely to strive for difficult things or their goals in life. Also, we think that this has the ability, when you use modern text, to affect the majority in a good way. Because we think now, like, young white boys have heroes. These are not just all old white men, because now they admire women and minority characters as a result of their exploits in these books. And we think as a result, they're more likely to take actions that could help minorities. For example, employing minorities in the future because they kind of see that they're similar and they hold similar values to the people that they respected greatly in these books, or rallying together in social movements that could help minority groups. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Great. So that substantive was 3 minutes long, which I think is a really good length for the MACE format, particularly given that you have so much rebuttal to get through in the amount of time that you have allocated for a second proposition speech. I think that was really great. Did any of you guys have any other thoughts on the material and what we could do to change or tweak or improve it?
I think one of the things which often helps clarify substantive arguments is having lists in there, and lists of mechanisms especially are very useful. So maybe even your impacts, like 3 different impacts in terms of how you interact with people, or 3 different ways that we think these books look different. So there's more women at the front, there's more minorities, and thirdly, those characters are treated the same as everyone else and not as completely different people as classic books tended to. So I think just having lists in there would have helped the structure a bit, because at points you did feel a little bit lost.
That's some really useful advice. Luke, did you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that it might be perhaps useful in your argument, Daniel, if you just point out that a lot of the time, kids don't necessarily have the time or have motivation to read for themselves. So oftentimes, if we're not making them read these stories in English, then they're not going to get access to them in any way at all. And that's really important, your argument about diversity and representation. So I think just pointing out that this is a really crucial way to actually get these stories to children in the first place.
Great. I think the final thing that I would add is that it'd be really great if you guys went away and did a little bit more research on some more examples that we can use to just compare and contrast the representation or presentation of minority characters within classical texts and how we would much prefer they're represented in our English curriculums through these modern texts. So if we could go and just do a little bit of research to find some useful examples to help us make that argument, I think it could be even more compelling than it is right now. But otherwise, very well done. We hope that this has been a useful insight into how to prepare for MACE debating. Preparing for the MACE is always a collaborative endeavor that whole debate societies can get involved in, even speakers that won't be participating in the actual MACE round itself. And we hope that this has provided great evidence of how you could go about preparing for your next MACE round. Thanks everyone for taking part, and goodbye.